Hello everybody and welcome to another episode of Alex's Afternoon Art Show. Today we are drawing Spider-Man Noir. So, as you could probably guess, given that we're doing a Spider-Man, we're doing posing as our primary topic today. We're going to have certain parts of this which are going to be very easy, certain parts of this which are going to be very hard. One of the things that's going to be very easy is going to be the colors, because there's like three of them, i.e., well, they're all different shades of black and grey, so yeah, they're going to be pretty easy in that sense. So, within reason, a lot of this is going to be easy. Outside of that, some of it might be difficult. I don't know. There's a lot of this pose which like bits are covering other bits, so you'll see that whenever I get into it. I sort of you'll just see. I sort of have to kind of rationalize this in my brain here. How I'm going to work this out. But anyways, yeah, enough incoherent rambling. I'll just roll the intro and then I'll show you what I've got, because then it'll be easier to explain. So yeah, I'll do that. Alright, so this is what I've got. So like I said, this is a pose in which a lot of stuff is being covered by other stuff. For example, this arm is sort of covering a lot of things here. So for those with the eagle eye, you might notice that I used basically every time I draw Spider-Man, I use imagery from the games as reference, because it's very easy to do so. So I use one of the loading screens as reference here, because it just makes my life a significant amount easier to do so. It also helps with proportioning to a degree, because Spider-Man should sort of be proportioned to be a little bit slimmer usually. And so he's got those proportions. He's not super buff or anything in that, so you can sort of work with those proportions a little bit easier. So yeah, I wanted to use stuff like the trench coat and the hat, but I didn't necessarily want him wearing that. So instead, the idea is that he's doing this big exaggerated swing, where he's sort of like the momentum's really pulling, like the coat is flying back and all this stuff. So he's holding his hat because it's fallen off, is the idea. So he's caught his hat and he's still swinging with the one hand. So yeah, we've got a pretty intense one. I might have to do some speed lines for the background on this. I would say, like I mentioned, the colors aren't going to be too difficult, because all of Spider-Man Noir's colors are black or grey, so realistically speaking, this shouldn't be too bad. All in all, some of this it might even be easy. I don't want to jinx it, but it could be. There's a not insubstantial possibility that this could be easy. However, I'm going to need to suss out quite a few different tones of grey in this. For example, I can get away with the boots, the gloves, and maybe parts of the mask, and maybe even this sort of core, like the sort of waistcoat on the inside of the trench coat, being the same kind of black color. Then the trench coat and the hat can be the same color. The trousers are one grey. I think that's sort of everything, actually, sort of thought out covered. But yeah, so the posing. As I always say, posing is not just how the limbs are positioned. However, that's also very important whenever you're doing Spider-Man, because realistically, when you're drawing Spider-Man, you need to just have all of the limbs kind of going in various different directions. Now, in my experience, I use a lot of imagery from the games as reference, because that's effectively a new Spider-Man pose generator that will give you a few ideas if you're struggling. So in this instance, I decided to go for, the idea being, well, there's a few different ones of these poses where he's got his legs tucked up and then he's got one of the arms down, and then obviously in this instance he's got one hand back, one hand forward, two legs up. Now there's obviously different variations as you can do of where he's not as hunched in, maybe he's got the arm down because he's pulling the web like that, and he's swinging forward like this, something like that, and then the legs are up, and then he's got his hand like down low between his legs. And you can sort of do that, where maybe you bring one leg forward, put one leg back. So there's a lot of different stuff you can do, but generally speaking, you need to have it all the limbs sort of need to be bending or in some sort of weird, interesting position. Because that's all the, like with Spider-Man. Spider-Man especially needs some very dynamic poses in order to work. You can't sort of do like the way that you might be able to get away with Batman. With Batman, you can get away with very static poses because Batman, a lot of Batman's imagery involves Batman sort of standing there or sort of kind of doing that sort of stuff. Like any of these sort of more static poses, you can sort of get away with Batman. Whereas with Spider-Man, you sort of need a lot of movement, a lot of stuff going on, and selling that movement is also very important. So, for example, it's actually easier to sell movement whenever you've got stuff like a cape or a coat in this instance, because, for example, you can see that he's moving fast because the coat is just flying straight back, pretty much. It's coming off of him and then flying straight backwards, so he's going pretty fast. And then there'll be some speed lines just to dictate, like, oh, he's really going fast this way, something like that. Probably. I have to think about this now. So if I do speed lines, I'm gonna have to probably do them like coming out like that. This will be somewhat similar to the Batman Beyond I did a few weeks ago, of where the speed lines will all be coming from the one place. Really, there might be some small ones over here just to sort of complete the picture. But yeah, there'll be some. Really, the core speed lines will be coming from like this side, like that, and then maybe a few tiny ones, one or two, like maybe big ones over here, and then just back to the big ones here. Yeah, that sort of stuff won't be too hard. I'm thinking I could do speed lines, or I could do a sort of dotted texture to make it look like newsprintier. Do some screen tone on the background to maybe sort of make it look a little bit more old-timey. The background's also going to be black and white. The whole thing is black and white because it makes sense. This is Spider-Man Noir. That's sort of the color palette we're going to be going for. The tones that I use aren't whenever I'm coloring this, aren't necessarily going to be purely grey tone. They're not going to be purely on that left side of the color wheel or the color picker, like I mean here. They're not going to purely be along here. They might dip out a little bit into the more slightly more skewed colors in that sense. I don't think they're going to be purely grey toned. However, obviously that'll get color corrected then whenever the black and white goes on, the gradient maps at the end, because that's sort of what I'm going to be doing here. Is I'm going to be having an idea like that. So I think for the background I'll probably just do a pretty simple circular gradient, probably a whiter color than out to a pure black. And then if that's the case, then my speed lines are probably going to be white, or they could be grey, but probably end up making them white because they'll just stand out more. We'll see what I do when it comes to that dotted idea, because the dotted idea, any of that sort of background sort of dotting, would very much conflict with the speed lines. So if I'm doing the dots, I can't really do the speed lines, and vice versa, because they'll sort of hard conflict with each other. Unless what I do is I have the sort of circular gradient and then I have my dots be the exact same color as the darkest color, so that way whenever I can do dots basically around the edges, so that sort of vignettes it to a degree. It creates like this sort of vignetting that then sort of fades in to the center of the gradient, and then I can still put the white over it with the speed lines, because the speed lines, I'm not going to do a ton of them. I'll do enough of them so that you get the idea, but I don't want to overdo it with the speed lines, because it's very easy to do, is to overdo it with the speed lines, and they take a while to do, so it's not exactly a quick process in that sense. But yeah, I suppose a lot of the posing stuff I've already kind of gone over. Yeah, like it's just a lot of stuff of where it's like, okay, the pose here is sort of like fun, of where it's like he's holding the hat as well, so it's like, yeah, there's all the elements there, and then obviously so the posing. I'm losing my voice a little bit. But yeah, with then the web also follows the movement of the arm. So the web comes out obviously bottom of the wrist, so that then follows, or bottom of the palm, end of the wrist, and then that sort of flows out like that, sort of carries the movement of the arm. Then the pose of the arm here is kind of flying back, and he's holding the hat and all that stuff. So it's, yeah, there's these little funny elements. Like, again, I think the holding the hat is a nice little funny element. But yeah, in the interest of time, I think I'm going to begin these details, because I don't think there's a huge amount I need to go over other than what I've already said. Yeah, I think I've kind of covered it. But yeah, oh yeah, I think I've covered everything I needed to do. So yeah, I'll do these details and then I'll be back for the colors, which, you know, might be the easiest part. Who knows? We'll see, I guess. Anyways, I'll do these details. I'll be back. So yeah. Alright, so that is our details done. That wasn't too difficult, really. I didn't have to really alter all that much. I just sort of deepened the lines on the bottom of his boot so that it appears more, so that obviously there's ridges on it, because that's how you do, because that's the sort of shape of a boot, especially a boot like this. It has these sort of ridges going along the bottom of it. I didn't apply much detailing to stuff like the inside of, or like the sort of waistcoat on the inside, or even the inside of the actual trench coat, because you don't really need it. There's very little of it on show. I sort of added a little seam to the inside of the inside of the wrist and to the inside of the legs, because realistically speaking, you should be seeing one. I think technically he should have like a gun holster on this leg, but I think roughly where his arm is covering where that holster should be. So I suppose I lucked out on that one, that I don't have to draw it. But yeah, so obviously the web, I'll do that later. I'll just do that as a white line. I'll do that during this section. I'll do that at some point. It won't be too difficult, so I'll just throw it in at some point here. I'll sort of do the little nodding bits on the web as well, because that's sort of how I prefer to draw the web. So I'll just do a little line and then sort of go back over it and sort of add little bits of little lines that are sort of flaking off and then nodding along it. But yeah, that's the sort of thing which I'll do with that. I'll have to do pretty much my whole background during this section, I think, because I'll have to do the speed lines and everything here as well. So I'll have to do some variety of gradient. I'm going to need to probably bring this up to about here as the sort of black color, and then the white I don't think should be quite a pure white. I think it should be about there, and then sort of just have something like this going on. I'd say something like that ish, maybe a little bit more dark than that, something a little bit darker, maybe something more like this even. So yeah, that looks a little bit better to me. And then I'll do that sort of vignetting thing that I mentioned before, sort of pick a color that's roughly the same. I'll just use this same grey color that I've used here, and then I need to, you know what, let's do this. I was gonna put that in a different layer, but I'll just do this and then I'll just make the layer again, make my life easier. That's easier than having to do that. So yeah, I'll probably just do all my background bits now, and then I'll go over the colors afterwards, because that'll take like 5 minutes just to do this stuff now, so I'll just get dots there. And then I'll do all that stuff. At the start of this section, I'm going to be back to do the painted shading, which I don't think will take very long. I'll be sort of doing some sort of softer paints, just so that it has a bit more of like a bloomier look, sort of that kind of soft lighting. I might see about maybe applying some grain to this one. We'll see, because the grain can be very bad looking. So that's the sort of thing that I'm thinking here, is that it's not always great looking, but it might work, who knows. But yeah, we'll see. I'll have a think about it. But yeah, that'll be later anyways. If that doesn't work, I'll just make the texture more intense later on. So anyways, I'll do these colors and then the background and everything as well, and then I'll be back to do the painted shading. So yeah, anyways, I'll carry on. Alright, that's our colors and our background stuff done. I'm actually pretty happy with the sort of dot vignetting that sort of blends into the background. It sort of adds a nice mid-tone to the between the obviously the white and then the darker grey at the back. I think that blends nicely. So I did the speed lines and everything obviously, but I didn't want it to look too similar to the webs, so I just lowered the opacity on it a little bit so that they would turn a little bit grey, and obviously these outer ones would sort of just fade away. As I said, I didn't do too many of them. I sort of kept it a little bit more minimal than I might normally do. A lot of the time I go a little bit too overboard. With the speed lines, there's only like the one or two that are actually like all that really intense that sort of come in more. Basically the idea with speed lines is the longer the speed line is, the more intense it is the sort of thought, I think. That's sort of how I think of it, at least, is that the longer the speed line is, typically the more intense it makes things seem. So if you have a bunch of really thin ones at the edge, they're sort of gonna be, they're not gonna make it seem all that intense. But if you have a few ones that really like shoot towards the point of interest from the very edge of the screen, that'll make you go like, whoa, that's like super intense. So that's the sort of thought I have there. At least, obviously the silver should be a little bit duller, but obviously it's going to get washed out quite a bit by the both A, the gradient map, and B, the painted shading that I'm doing right now. So I think in terms of these, I'm basically going to be using like black and white as my colors. I'll probably, so for this, the silver, which I'm shading first, this is technically like, yeah, like a bluier color. So I'll make this purple, will be the tone I'll use, but I'll just make it like here. And again, I'm going to remain I'm going to sort of stick to that idea of where they're going to be mostly pretty minor. They're going to have a slight skew to the color, but otherwise they're going to be grey toned for the most part. That'll be the same with the painted shading and then with the detailed shading as well. And then I'll have a white light line at the very end, probably. I don't see a reason to do any sort of weird colourful light line because it'll just get washed out by the gradient map anyways. But the gradient maps are obviously going to be grey toned. But we'll see sort of how this is going to work, because again, very rare is it that I use just almost entirely grey tones, because that's what I've done here, is it's pretty much entirely grey tones. There's not much in the way of colour variety going on here. So yeah, it's pretty much all grey tones. So I suppose we'll see once the painted shading is done, that will sort of have a little bit, a very brief splash of colour in it, but then the gradient maps will then colour correct that back to greys. So it'll sort of probably darken things up a little bit more in that sense. But yeah, what else was I going to say? My lightest will probably still be a sort of like very soft yellow colour, because I'm probably going to have the gradient maps not be pure black and white. I'll probably give them a slight sort of a slightly warmer hue, just so that sort of bloominess is there. There is a thought that I have here which could work, of maybe doing some sort of grain and blur and stuff like that. That might sort of work. I don't know if it will or not, but we'll see. I have an idea, but I'll go into that later, because that might be something that I'll have to do that later. Anyways, that'll be during the detailed shading or whenever I do that sort of stuff. But anyways, without further ado, I'll just get on with this painted shading, because it won't take very long, and then I'll be back to sort of after having had a think about some of that other stuff. I'll sort of break that down and maybe try it or not. But yeah, anyways, I'll get on with this. Okay, so that's our painted shading done. So I've had to think, and I think that a thing that I could do is, in order to create the bloom effect that I want, would be that I could create a duplicate layer of the colors. And tell you what, I'll do it right now and see if I can do that. Duplicate the group. So that is now, I've got two of these, so now I'll tell you what, I'll just merge the group, so now that is that. Now, what I could do is I can set this to, I can do a filter, set this to be blur, set it to be Gaussian blur, just set it to be something a little less intense than that, just set it to be a light blur, like that, like maybe about here-ish. Maybe about that much, maybe even less, maybe even just less than that, maybe 8. And then make that an overlay. Now then, If I make it a different type of layer, make it a dissolve. No, a dissolve is a little ugly looking. Be a lighten maybe? No, not quite. Well, while it's on lighten, is that even... I think it's sort of doing something. It just makes it a lot brighter. Yeah, it just makes it a lot brighter. It also softens these elements, which again, I don't necessarily need it to do that. Screen tone? Nope. Definitely not. Multiply? No, that'll make it too dark. Overlay would have been the thing that I'd thought of. So it's got the Gaussian blur. Is there a different type of blur perhaps that I might instead use? Lens blur, radial blur, no, none of these are quite what I want. Store noise, I can apply noise to it, but that's not necessarily what I need. None of these are really what I'm looking for. Okay, so right, the blur is exactly what it needs to be. So if I set it to be overlay, yeah, set it to be overlay, or maybe what about soft light? Soft light is subtler, because it is still darker, but that, see, the problem is it still needs to have the sort of blurring effect on the outside of it. What about an overlay? Yeah, overlay still has the sort of blurring on the outside, but that just generally makes it a little too dark. Luminosity, no. Hue, no, it makes it invisible. Saturation, no, it's invisible. Pen light, no. Linear light, too dark. Hard light, too dark. Vivid light, too dark. Lighter color, no. Linear dodge, no. Color dodge, no. Okay, so perhaps that might not work. So what I'll do is I'll leave that off and I'll leave it there. I might use that later, but that's something to maybe think about after I've maybe done the all the rest of everything else, to maybe see if I can get that to work. But I don't think I'll be able to add really the grain. I don't think that'll work properly. What I could do is I could add the grain to the first gradient map and then just duplicate it so that it'll have the grain and it'll have increasing grain as the gradient maps are put on top of each other. That could work, but just have it be a low amount of grain, so that it's not too overbearing in that sense. I suppose effects are now becoming a big part of this, so maybe I'll have to include that in the title. But yeah, so grain. Well, you have to think about that. So the grain, yeah, I could do that with gradient maps. That's something that's very doable. But the bloominess was the thing that I wanted to try and do here, was to use this and get that sort of bloominess going on with the color. What? So that's interesting. So that's it over the details. Huh. That is interesting how that looks. That does sort of have the look that I kind of want, but on over, it's just too dark is the problem. Whenever it's on anything but normal, it's just too dark. Lighten kind of works. How do I leave it on lighten? And then just lower the opacity to be like 25%. It's subtle, but it has like a nice bloominess to it. Because we don't want this to be too intense, I suppose, but it does obviously soften a lot of our kind of the grit to our shading. But yeah, just overlay I think is just too dark. Overlay also doesn't have that sort of bloominess to it, does it? Yeah. Alright, tell you what, I'll have a think about that. We might see how that looks at the end, but that's obviously... I'll need that off anyways while I'm doing the detailed shading. So anyways, I suppose that's enough kind of screwing around with effects and things like that. But yeah, there's a lot of that to be done here, I guess. Anyways, I will do this detailed shading and the light line and everything, and then I'll come back and I'll do the gradient maps, and we'll do all that last little bit of polish. So right, I need to do that bit of blur, or not blur, I need to do the green on the gradient maps, which shouldn't be too hard. Shouldn't be too hard. The texture, I suppose, might reintroduce some of the sort of grittiness I'm losing on the character. I'll have to think about that. Who knows? I think it'll work. It should work, but we'll see. Anyways, I will do this, and then I'll be back to do those last little bits, and I'll wrap up. So yeah. Okay, so that is basically us done for all intents and purposes. That's the detailed shading and the light line done. I decided to leave on our sort of bloomier bit here because I think I like how it looks. I do like how it looks, but we'll see how that interacts with our gradient maps because it might not coalesce all that well. So I need to do new adjustment layer, gradient map. We're basically not going to be changing this. I mean, yeah, look, that doesn't really change it much, all that. It doesn't really change it all that much. So what I'm going to do is, that's still going to be black, this is still going to be white. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to skew them ever so slightly. So this should be a slightly off-white. And then this should be a slightly kind of purple black. Like that, and then our mid-tone definitely isn't going to be that color. It's probably going to be a red, and it's going to be like a grey like that, more or less. And then, right, so I can't see myself needing to really tinker with that all that much, so on overlay, I'm not going to change anything other than just making it a lot darker. Soft light is probably what we're going to want to go for. Now we're going to need to, oh yeah, before I do any incredible tinkering with this, I'm going to need to go into my filters, get my noise, add noise, and then just uniform versus Gaussian. Doesn't make much of a difference, does it? Yeah, we don't want it to be too crazy. Maybe about 100%. Or maybe even 89, 84%. Go with that. We want it to be visible when we zoom in, because yeah, there it is visible whenever we zoom in. You can see the grain, but it isn't like super overpowering, because bear in mind we're going to be putting 3 more, or we're going to be putting 2 more of these on, and this is going to be lowered in opacity, so it's about 60%. Now that grain is still there, but it's a little bit more subtle now. So I'm going to make a duplicate of that, which still has the grain. Indeed it does. This one's going to be a luminosity. This one's going to be, let's see what it's like on 30%. Grain is getting a little bit more intense. So that's worth noting. Is that like on top versus on the bottom? Doesn't appear to make really any difference whatsoever, so I'll just leave it on top. Now we're going to want another duplicate. This one's going to be a color burn, and this one's going to be 5%. What's that like on 30? God, that's actually really intense, the grain on the color burn. Does this actually make a huge amount of a difference? It just darkens everything. Right, so I'll leave that on, I'll leave it on 10% because that'll keep the grain visible at the very least. Yeah, because it darkens up the grain quite a bit. I like the grain. I think the grain is an interesting thing. It's very visible from here, I think, which is the nice part. Even with, what was I going to say? Even with, yeah, I think the sort of light in here on that looks pretty good. The sort of bloom works on that. Again, it didn't really change the colors all that much. I mean, yeah, like this is just, it just makes them deeper and darker for the most part. It just kind of ups the contrast. The gradient maps here, and they're also sort of necessary in having the grain stick to something, because if I didn't have that, I would effectively have to save this as a JPEG, then put that over the top, a JPEG or a PNG, either or. Just save it as an image, then drop that back into this file as a separate image over everything, then put grain on that. And then lower the opacity, just so that it sort of works in that way. But yeah, right, okay, so now the texture. Texture, which I'm curious to see how this interacts with the grain, because there's obviously quite a bit of grain now. Grain is somewhat subtle. I think perhaps the grain might get a little bit lost in the texture, so I might not make the texture too crazy. That's it on overlay. There's it at 15%. Because, yeah, you can still see the grain, but it's a lot subtler now when it's interacting with the texture. I might make the texture even more subtle, 10% maybe, because the texture will interact with the sort of bloom nicely is the only thing there that I think the texture is like kind of necessary for, and also adding like some sort of a nice little bit of blend to the what do you call it, to the gradient in the background. So yeah, that's basically that done. There was a lot of weird little effects things I decided to try at the end there, but as you can see, the sort of slight yellow hue is still very much there. However, I mean, this is very much, it's still predominantly gray tones. Because yeah, like I mean, the purpliness of the darker shading is 100% gone, and the yellowness of the lighter part is only moderately visible. So yeah, that's sort of how this is going. That's how this was going to work anyways. It was always going to have sort of have that stuff sucked out of it in the first place. But that was always the goal here, was to sort of have this be a very subtle sort of color palette, have it be very gray toned, very sort of black and white monochrome, being the sort of idea of the whole thing. But yeah, I think this definitely stands out, especially when put next to a lot of the other ones I've been doing recently, alongside a lot of the other drawings I've had recently. This definitely sticks out as a very different looking one. This has also been a very short one, because this has only been 3 hours. 3 hours and 15 minutes so far. So yeah, realistically been a pretty quick one. Not too difficult. Just very tired today, so that has maybe made this a little bit more difficult than it otherwise would have been. But yeah, I think all those little elements come together nicely. I think the speed lines are a good sort of thing, just to add a little bit more intensity to this. And the dots in the background add a little bit of sort of the dots aren't lost by the speed lines, because the speed lines are subtle enough where they don't overpower it. The dots do a nice little job of adding that sort of newsprinty look to it. I think maybe it's not the dots aren't small enough where it's actually like screen tone, like semitones or any of that stuff. They're obviously far too big for that sort of thing, but it just evokes the idea of it, which is all I needed. I didn't need it to actually be looking like screen tone, because that would have been, I think, a little too much. The grain, I think, works nicely. It's subtle. It's not the type of thing I would normally use, but it's subtle, and it has a nice sort of, it adds a nice little sort of subtle little bit of old-timiness to this, as does that sort of bloom layer that I tried to get going there. But I think it's maybe a lot more subtle than I would have liked, but it's better than nothing. I think when you know it's there, it adds something, but I don't think you'd necessarily notice something. I don't think you'd necessarily notice it. But yeah, whenever it does add something once you know it's there. It adds a sort of softness to a lot of the sort of paints and everything that are on this, which otherwise would kind of be lost. But yeah, I think that's sort of everything I wanted to talk about. I think that's everything I wanted to do with this. This was an easy enough one. That's all I really wanted out of it, was for an easy one. Because it's been a while since I've had one of those. The last couple have all been kind of tricky. Not even necessarily kind of tricky, but just a little bit more time consuming. Because I'm trying to think. Yeah, no, they've all been kind of tough in one way or another. I mean, there was low angle stuff with Doctor Doom. There was all the stuff with Wonder Woman, with all the color stuff, and then having to do all those little tweaks and changes to the drawing. And even Supergirl, that was just stressful because of the ancillary stuff of the footage breaking. But yeah. Anyways, I think I'm good to leave this there. To leave it there, I will do my outro, and then I'll leave you. So, if you liked the video, do whatever it is that you'd normally do, whether that be liking or not. I'd of course prefer if you liked it, but I can't make you do that, so I can only politely suggest it, which I believe I did. It's the same deal. If you want to subscribe, you know where the subscribe button is. It's below the video. I didn't need to tell you that, just a courtesy. You can do whatever it is that you'd like to do with said subscribe button. Smashing it, touching it, pressing it. However it is that you would prefer to handle the subscribe button. If you've got any suggestions for what you'd like to see me draw in the future, you can leave a comment, politely worded. I'll see it regardless, but, you know, well, actually do it if you do. Well, I'll consider doing it if it's politely worded. If it's not polite, I'm not going to do it. And yeah, if you choose to watch the next video, I'll see you next time. So, with all that said, that is us. So, I will say goodbye and I'll leave you. So, bye-bye.